I always problematize the term post-colonial because a lot of people see it as if it is a marker, as if it is a temporal marker, right? That colonialism is over and post-colonialism has started. Technically, colonialism continues in different forms of imperialisms and everything else. So post-colonialism became an acceptable term in academia because it was less threatening. Like it was less threatening to the dominant group in opposition to offering them anti-imperialist discourse or something like that. So the connection between colonialism and post-colonial studies is kind of a complex connection because what is it that we do in post-colonial studies? Primarily, we study what happened during the contact phase, right? And what happens after the colonizers physically leave the territory, what kind of political and social life emerges in the post-colonies. But part of the study is also what other histories are there which were overwritten by the colonial discourses. How can we retrieve them, re-articulate them? And it does all these things. So there are people who go and retrieve silenced knowledges like the Subaltern Studies Collective in India and all of our other Marxist friends. That's their project. Then there are people like in Pakistan and elsewhere who go and try to read their own native texts and say, well, here is what we have produced culturally, and we would like to talk about those. But in one way or the other, what I encourage my students to is that don't think in reactionary terms, right? There is no point in saying, oh, you have done great things, but we have done great things too. We don't need to prove it to anyone that we have done great things too. So my emphasis in post-colonial studies, when I was a professor, and even the book that's coming out, it has always been challenging whatever is offered as a norm, right? Here is how you should behave in 20th century, or this is how you should read literary texts. And if it is Eurocentric or Americocentric, my effort has always been to complicate that by suggesting, no, there are other ways of teaching, there are other ways of reading texts, and there are other ways of living in the world. And that's how I kind of understand my practice of post-colonial studies.
What is the aftermath of what is the aftermath and legacy of colonization on people of color or on Muslim people, for example?
So think of it this way, like let's take an example. Let's take India, for example, right? Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. A lot of people, like people who are apologists for colonialism, would tell you, well, we brought democracy and all that. And my question simply to them always is a very simple question, that if Britain treated India equally as a co-equal part of a partnership, then materially we can just look at history and say, 1947, the British leave India. The capital of India is New Delhi. And the capital of England, United Kingdom, is London. If, in terms of material development, both the cities are at the same level, then it was an equal relationship, because for 200 years that the British held India, they were building it with India's wealth, just as they were building the infrastructure of the mother country. If they didn't leave, and we're just talking about buildings and roads, right? We're not even talking about intellectual growth and all that. But if they didn't leave it in that shape, then that means that it was an unequal occupying relationship, right? So what is the aftermath? There's a beautiful book by Achille Mbembe called On the Post-Colony, in which he talks about, one of the biggest problem that happens under colonialism is that the habits and thoughts that are developed under that are not the habits and thoughts of democracy, right? So since the system of government that's introduced is top down, it's bureaucratic, right, and non-representative, the kind of human subjects that emerge, even when they're highly educated, have those kind of bureaucratic minds. They buy into that system. So the colonizers leave. Well, we inherit those infrastructures, those modes of thinking the world and behaving in it. So think of Pakistan, right? Who is the most powerful person in your district, or even now that's your DC? I mean, they now call them DPOs, but it's your deputy commissioner, it's your police commissioner. These were the same people who were powerful when the British were there. In 70 years, we have not been able to replace the administrative machinery that was put in place by the British by a representative system, right? By a system of people who have been elected by people. So this is like one of the legacies in the way we manage our systems in the post colonies. But in terms of how we think, how we behave, what kind of class structure develops. So if you look at Pakistani educational system, right, we have government schools which are underfunded. We have English medium schools. Now we have schools that only offer Cambridge and Oxford curriculum, right? And then we have internalized that. So if you talk to an average uncritical middle class Pakistani, to him, I am a Pendu because I went to government schools and I didn't study at those. So there is this class hierarchy that highly educated people still maintain, right? And these are what I would say, undying legacies of a colonial system, which was left to us, and we have perpetuated it in so many ways. And beyond that, just the material, we live in a world where 10 or 15 countries pretty much own the wealth of this entire planet. And everyone else in this world is indebted to IMF and all. So all we are doing in the developing countries or in the third world is working for these banks, right? Paying our debt. All of these are legacies of previously the colonial system, but now an unequal economic system, right? Which privileges certain nations of the North and their allies in so many ways.
Well, the British, one of the things they did was the policy was divide and rule, but also they had this official policy of, they said, the white man's burden, and we are here to civilize the dirty natives. And so there is that supremacy complex, white supremacy. So is one of the aftermaths of that racism is that, part of colonial mentality is that we have internalized an inferiority complex?
Well, I don't think in terms of like collective inferiority complexes, but the thing is, and I have interacted with a lot of people in Pakistan, and like powerful people, and I see how they behave with me, right? Masood Raja, who used to be equally as good or bad a professor as anyone else, and the colleagues that I would take with me in my program, right? The way they would treat me. Maybe it's because I was one of their own, so they treated me differently. But you could see the behavior, and that comes from that kind of a subservient mindset, right? Which a lot of people have internalized, and it's culturally perpetuated. Think of our own young days. We had to go and discover our own poetry, our own songs, our own music, because it was cool to, listen to rock and roll and rock and others. So in any given culture, what is it that you privilege in your colleges and universities? Most universities, by the time you get to a bachelor's program, they don't even have Urdu departments. They don't have Punjabi or Sindhi departments, but every university has an English department. Now, when you emphasize English and when you connect it to its power in the world, and you tell people, okay, you have to learn English if you want a job, you have to learn this. So people internalize, and this comes from Ngugi Thiong'o. They are not just learning that this is the language of power. What they are also learning is that their own language is inferior. And some of it, we do it ourselves. Like, you will encounter people in India and Pakistan who will make fun of your accent, right? Who would say, so and so speaks a heavily accented English, and so all of this obviously comes from having internalized a norm, right, which previously was in place because of colonialism and now is in place because of the power of the social and economic and cultural power of United States in the world, right? And sadly, though, I would say the solution isn't that we develop these purist ideologies and say, no, I'm going to be a Sindhi and I'm going to be a Baloch and Punjabi. That's not going to solve the problem. I think the solution, in my humble opinion, is, yeah, learn the skills that are out there, learn the knowledges, but learn them with a critical thought in mind, weigh them down and then challenge anytime any kind of social or political knowledge offers itself as the norm, right? And that I in my and if there is something useful, we have Marxist friends over here. If there is something useful, borrow it, right? Make it your own. Uh, so that's has been my effort, like for the last 10 years, is placing myself in that impossible position where I'm neither for the, of course, I'll never be with the powerful or with the powerful nations, but where I don't also want to be a nativist, right? Where I say, okay, let's acknowledge what went wrong, what was done to us, what is still being done to us, but where it's our own fault as professors, as teachers, as activists, then we, change our own ways of doing things.
So you mentioned, the different kinds of norms that are out there, and there's a social worker, Resma Manakam. He says that what we have been taught in the U.S. is that white bodies are the standard, and everybody else, the non-white bodies, are deviant. Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned that, what is norm and so on, and to have a critical perspective. In the U.S. these days, there's a lot of controversy about critical race theory.
Yeah, think of it. Where is that pushback coming from against critical race theory? It is the dominant privileged group, right? And what they are saying is, oh, if you teach critical race theory, people would rather know about the conflictual nature of United States history instead of thinking that we are, all one. Now, it is always people on the periphery, people who are outside the promise of a nation or the world, who are always agitating and finding new ways of changing the world because it matters to them, right? And so the response is always reactionary. Powers that be do not want us to think critically. They don't want us to think in terms that maybe what's happening to me is deeply structural and not just individual. I can't just change my boss and hope I will do better, because if the structures are the same, then chances are it doesn't matter where we are. So I think the reason critical race theory is so threatening to these people is because it goes against the structure. It tries to lay bare the structure that normalizes certain people's privilege. And if we teach that to our students, then they will start asking questions instead of saying, what do I need to learn to improve my resume so that I can come and work for you, we start questioning the very practices of improving our resume instead, right? And you see that in the post colonies too. If you look at Pakistan or India, the dominant groups, they don't want us to give people critical education. I mean, Spivak, Gayatri Spivak has a great example of it. She used to go and teach, at a village elementary school pretty much every summer. And all she would teach those students is not just the skills, but habits of thinking about their life critically. And at a certain point, the local zamindars basically told her she couldn't come and do that. Because if those people start thinking critically about their life, then they would understand why is it that their lives are the way they are. So that's why these praxis and philosophies are so threatening to the established dominant groups.
Yes, so it reminds me of the idea that the schools were created on the model of a factory. And just like a factory creates a product, the product is a person, is an employee who's going to be obedient, and docile, and will conform and not think critically. So it could, because if a person thinks critically, they are a threat to the status quo.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, think of it like when you mentioned the docile bodies, and Foucault has, a lot of work on it. But let's think of America. In United States, we can't forcefully make people docile, right? We can't do that through oppression. I mean, they do that through oppression too. Of course, there are different kinds of oppressions. So the educational system is an ideal tool for that, right? So after the 60s, if you look at post 1960s counterculture movement and all, the federal government invested heavily in how to incorporate students within the projects of power. And they did that through what? Through, you know, the loan system, student loan system. So if your student loan is connected to your good behavior and can be pulled back or withdrawn, chances are you're not going to risk arrest. You're not going to stand in the street because you're like, hey, I need to make these grades to keep my student aid. I need to, stay this side of the law so that I can maintain my student aid. And so that automatically creates bodies and consciousnesses who police themselves, right? Based in what they see as their self-interest. And it wasn't just this. I mean, if you look at the buildings at big universities, especially in California and Texas, if you look at how the buildings are structured, the way they are structured is so that large number of people, they cannot move forward. They get split. You'll see a stairway over there, a stairway over there, because the buildings were structured so that people cannot move in mass, right? And so how do we create docile bodies in a so-called democracy is make them worry about their credit score, right? Tell them, make their lives precarious by telling them, there is no socialized health care. So you have to get a job to get it. So you get a job to get health insurance. Chances are you're not going to ask a lot of questions because you're not just worried about losing your job. You're also worried about losing your health insurance, right? Which so many of us depend on. All of these things are ideological ways of making our lives precarious, but also making our bodies docile, right? Ideal bodies for capital. Now, if you look at neoliberal capitalism, I mean, precarity, without precarity, the capital cannot be profitable. It needs cheap labor and it needs labor that doesn't ask too much, right? And anytime you try to develop some kind of critical consciousness at a job or elsewhere, you will see there are so many laws against it because They have to keep the labor force compliant here and elsewhere as well. And the best way of doing it is slowly chipping at their attempts at getting to know more and then coming together. Now, if you look at the American educational system, K-12 system, exactly the same thing has been replicated there. So we we have mandated state tests, right? And we have linked them to funding. So that means teachers do not have any time to say, today we're going to talk about Palestine, or today we're going to talk about, social injustices in the United States, because that's not going to be on the test. They are required to teach to the test so that students do well, so that the school can get its funding, right? And that is another way of keeping a population that is not critically aware of their own lives, because that's the population you need constantly to feed this machine called capital, right? And I mean, because people will then have time to say, okay, I can probably take a philosophy course that teaches me about ethics, and not necessarily geared towards I need to graduate in 4 years and then go get a job. But here is another thing that this system does. When you come out of the school system highly indebted, right? Your priority is not going to be to help humanity. So let's say you're a physician, you got your degree, and you owe $350,000 in loans. You can't afford to come out of medical school, do your residency, and then say, no, I'm going to go and work in poor communities and give people, no. Your priority is, which is the most prestigious place where I can get a job, which will pay me enough so that I can maintain a certain standard of life and then pay my student loan off. So it underwrites in so many ways your way of what to do in the world. It pre-decides it for you financially, that you can't even afford to be altruistic. You can't even afford to be kind and generous because you're carrying this huge dead weight that you have to pay off, right? Uh, I don't know. Did you ever watch Sicko, the Michael Moore movie on healthcare? There's a beautiful scene in that where he's talking to a Canadian doctor, right? A Canadian surgeon who had just done a surgery where they reattached 4 fingers of a person whose fingers had been severed. And Michael Moore asks him, what if the insurance company had told you they will pay only for 2 fingers, right? And the doctor looks at him and says, I will never work for a system like that. But he has the option, right? He's working in a nation where there is, socialized healthcare. A doctor over here, maybe 1 out of 99 would have said, okay, the insurance had turned you down, but I can reattach these. I will reattach your. They would basically just say, hey, your insurance said they'll cover 2 fingers. And maybe they wouldn't even think ethically about it because their way of thinking about these things has become mechanistic, right? They think of it in terms of what is permissible, what is not, and not what is their responsibility. And that happens like on a deeper level, the way we educate our people, the way we train them, right? And then those of you, people like you who go and work in the trenches, right? You already go in knowing that your own life is going to be highly precarious, right? And there isn't going to be much security in it. And you might get some resources to help the people that you're trying to help, but mostly, we're trying to get money from each other to help our communities and do that in the richest nation on the planet.
Speaking of Canada, you know, as far as conformity, how a docile society or domesticated society and conformist society does. If we can compare Canada and the U.S., in the U.S. they call it a melting pot approach. Come over here, we're going to melt you down and blend in with everybody else. We're going to make you homogenized, and it seems, conform to dominant culture. Whereas in Canada, the approach is salad bowl. Bring your best from your culture, and you're able to maintain your identity. So, would you say that this melting pot approach has also to do with these pressures that people of color who are not in the dominant class go through?
Well, I mean, I never bought into this idea of the melting pot or the salad bowl for that purpose. I mean, the thing is, uh, what people don't understand, people who are part of the powerful group anywhere, not just here, is that they lose the capacity to see the world from the point of view of others. They will say, well, we have laws that protect you. You are free to choose whatever you want. They don't look at the structural inequalities that already people have to face, right? And they say, well, if they are not successful enough, then probably they are lazy and all that. I mean, the way you move your body, you take it out in the world, it's different experience. So someone looking like me and you and elsewhere, depending on where we are, there are places if we go, you automatically feel out of place. You will be looked at differently, and you will be looked at as if you're suspicious. Certain people in America don't have to feel like that, right? Because the way they view the world, it's their world, right? Because the norm defaults on them, right? So the reason all these movements, identity movements, movements of inclusion, equity, and justice, I mean, this is what we call the recognitional register, right? Not redistribution. The idea behind it is that it shouldn't matter what my gender is, what my race, ethnicity, what my color is. I should be able to experience a space and be dealt with the same way as anyone else. So if I walk into a bank or an office or a government office, that is what is at stake, is that my humanity should be treated as equal to others, right? And so what is prejudice, or what is racism? Or racism is a denial of that equality, right? It's internalizing this idea that since I look like this, or I am somehow better than these people, right? That is what the fight is against. And then the structural inequalities that historically in United States, you mentioned Howard Zinn, right? Uh, of how, like, simply having a two-parent household, having some land that your grandfather owned, or that they had a house. If they had a house, if your grandparents in United States owned their own home, chances are they passed down some wealth to their next generation. But if you come from a poor family who didn't have that, then they are on a different temporality. Their experience of life is different. They don't have assets. They didn't have them. So, uh, so the idea of your struggle and my struggle and our struggles isn't just that we should be included. No, the idea is that deep down, structurally, it shouldn't matter who I am, where did I come from, right? The way I'm treated legally and culturally should be same, with respect and with dignity, right? And that people should have access to a good education and to a safe life. That's the fight. uh, and what you mentioned earlier, all these reactionary movements against critical race theory and others, the, because they're afraid that if people start asking these questions of this, if people lose faith in capitalism, right, which offers itself as normative and as the only system that exists in the world, and they start asking question, how is it that 85% of the wealth of this planet is owned by 30 or 40 people, right? Why is it that 2 billion people on this planet are starving, right? While Elon Musk can go and spend $44 billion on Twitter, unless you internalize this idea that somehow he earned it, he is superior to us. If you start chipping at that mythology, then it would lay bare how the rich get richer, right? And I would highly recommend Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, right? Because he gives us statistics. I mean, he statistically proves to us that super wealth has become patrimonial, right? You either have to marry into it, or be born in it. Working like you and me every single day, none of us will become wealthy. But the myth is there, right? I can write an app and become a millionaire, and because we take exceptions as the norm.
As Arundhati Roy says, that we are all subjects of the American empire.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she means, so would you say that we are all, around the world, are we just enslaved by the American empire?
Well, I mean, I love Arundhati Roy, and I love all my leftist friends, but it's not just the American empire now, it's also the Chinese empire, okay? And a lot of people in Pakistan have this highly romantic view of China. Like, I mean, here is a nation which has millions upon millions of its own citizens who are captive labor for global corporations, who have no rights, right? And the nation sells their labor to underwrite its, growth. So are we? Yes and no. I mean, here is the thing that we have to be subtle about in criticizing America. And I learned it over the years. I am an open critic of American imperial power. I believe America is an imperial power. I would like to acknowledge that there are millions upon millions of decent human beings who live in America as well. So when we criticize America, we have to be very focused about the power of American corporations and the power of United States government. But we must also acknowledge the decency and humanity of millions upon millions of Americans who live and die in this country and who are, by and large, decent and caring human beings. But beyond that, in terms of on the level of the system, yeah, I mean, think of it. I mean, the global wealth, it doesn't matter where you people are working. And these figures are laid about 20 years old, from Saskia Sassen's book, The Sociology of Globalization. When she wrote that book, at that time, 64% of the profits produced by the global multinationals always traveled back to the global north, right? Europe and United States, right? So, so that inequality is there in the world. So, are we subject? Do we live in the American imperium? Yes, we do. Is there a way out of it? Probably. I haven't figured it out yet, right? But what do वो उर्दू में कहते हैं ना, मुल्ला की दौड़ मस्जिद तक होती है. So what is it that we can do? You as a social activist and social worker, me as a former professor and intellectual, is that we constantly keep talking about these issues, keep sharing the little we know with the world so that more and more people keep asking questions. There's a beautiful saying by Deleuze where he says that power, and United States is a powerful, its tendency is to totalize, right? It must constantly totalize itself so that no other logic exists in the world. So the role of the intellectual is to constantly keep pricking it, because that's all we can do, right? We can't kill the elephant, but we can keep pricking it. I mean, not that I want to kill elephants, that's a bad metaphor. But so the idea is, if you keep pricking it here and there in solidarity with others, then the power cannot totalize itself, at least ideologically. And it's put to questions, right? And I think that's what Arundhati Roy has done so brilliantly within, her context, right, in India. And that is what you, me, and everyone else constantly need to keep doing. But here is where I differ with my leftist friends, right? The problem with my leftist friends is they stopped reading after Lenin and Trotsky, right? So they haven't even read, you know, Antonio Gramsci and people like Carlo Vercellone and Franco Berardi. So all this autonomous Marxism coming from Italy. So their views are still of a central hierarchy and a centralized communist party. And uh, we live in a world where power doesn't have a center anymore. It's diffuse, right? That's Foucault, and it courses through the world. The resistance to it then cannot be centralized either, right? It must come here, over there. All we can do is connect with each other and say, hey, we are pushing it here, you keep pushing it there. Build those lateral solidarities through the internet, right? The ideal tool of our enslavement, but also maybe of our liberation. That's how I think. And, I never offer my views as, exhaustive and fully formed. I don't think so. I can afford to do that.
Politico magazine said that there are 800 military bases in 800 American military bases in 70 countries.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times in the US, there's a denial that there's even a thing called the American Empire. And so is there such a thing as the American Empire? And what is the role of the military industrial complex in that imperialism agenda?
I mean, if you have read your Chomsky and heard him speak, he is the most eloquent critic of the military-industrial complex. I mean, think of it. America is a global power, right? And they don't just protect their territory. They have to protect their interests in the world. What is their interest in the world, right? That they have the economic edge that they have always had, right? That they maintain the standard of life, whatever they think of their citizens, right? Now think of it, there was a very hubristic statement that first Mr. Bush had made, and that was that we will never compromise the American standard of life or whatever, right? The idea behind it was that this mindset, this imperial mindset that we have the right to the world's resources and we have the might to protect it, right? Now that's a very hard sell in the world. You can't sell yourself as a military empire. So how does it work? It works through soft messaging. It works through protection. We're going to protect freedom here. We're going to do this over here, right? At the end of the day, I mean, I'm not saying that American politicians sit down and say we have to go conquer the world. No, they don't need to conquer the world. But I think they look at the world from the point of view of their own national interest. And then they safeguard that. And the military is there partially because, when they need it, but also the defense industrial complex, it generates a lot of economic activity. I mean, think of the contracts, right? But think of it this way. If the money that has been spent on the F-35 project, right? Someone had actually done the math. If you just took that money, right, you could completely transform the American educational system and American healthcare system, right? So it's not just the government then that is doing that. There are powerful interests at play, right? How does a legislation happen in United States, right? This is the only country in the world where you can pay a company to lobby so that a law can be made which is in your favor, right? It's kind of a legalized bribery, right? So these corporations, they defend their territories, right? They produce these technologies and then they sell it. Who is their biggest customer? United States of America. So it's a perpetual system, right? So I will never deny that United States is an imperial power. Uh, as I said, I'm on record for that in my publications. But the question is, how do we, the weak nations of the world, like in Pakistan and Bangladesh, how do they survive? So right now, they have bought into this developmental model, right? So they think in terms of we are behind. So we need better roads and we need a better banking system. Some of these things they cannot avoid. To do trade in this world, you have to agree to the copyright law. The copyright law was written by the powerful nations. You have to give assurances to the countries of the world that copyright law would be protected in your country. I mean, you have to write it down and sign it, right? So some of it is you can't even play in the global economy without agreeing to the terms that have already been pre-decided, right? And then what you end up doing is you start training your people not as your own individual citizens, you are training them to be functional within the global economy that someone else has decided how it will run, and that is the United States of America and Europe to some extent, and now the Chinese and Japanese, right? So, what are our options here, right? There is no grand communist party or socialist revolution. It's not going to happen, right? Because the reason is that when we did it without training ourselves as to what a socialist ought to be, right? That's why I recommend Freire, right? People should read Paulo Freire. So the alternative is to come together like we used to, like the group of 77, like the non-aligned movements, right? Where we come together as the poorer nations of the world, Africa, Asia, and then develop a consensus where you take a stand and say, okay, it's not going to be like this, that Apple wants to come to India and build a store, build their facility, and we give them all the tax breaks. If they already have one in Pakistan, we are not going to let them relocate, right? So that way, we are telling the global corporations, you can't exploit us by saying we are picking and leaving, right? That was one of the biggest problems post 1970s, was that because of WTO, which used to be GATT, nations had to give up their right to say, you can come in, but you will keep $2 billion in my country for 10 years. They had to concede that right. And they also had to concede the right that you will do some good work. This much of your money will be spent on these projects. So by conceding that right, what they also lost was control on capital flight. So if you look at 1987, when the Asian market crash happens, right? Why did it happen? Did the people stop working? Did the factories close? No, it happened because there was a rumor that one or two economies were in trouble, and because of that rumor, the investors pulled their money out. And since there were no controls on capital flight, they could pull their money out. So suddenly, these countries wake up in the morning and all the capital that was invested in their industry has suddenly vanished, right? Now, IMF went in and forced these countries to raise their interest rates, right? So what is it? The logic. Okay, capital is moving freely in the world, right? If you raise your interest rate, it is going to come back to you because it wants to harvest that high interest rate, right? That's the logic behind it. So Mahathir Mohamad was the one who refused to do so. And his argument was, if I raise my interest rate, my housing market, commercial and the domestic housing market is already overextended. If I raise the interest rate, my housing market will collapse. And if that collapses, it doesn't matter how much investment comes in. And so it took him 10 years to recover. All the other countries took 20 years to recover. a crisis not caused by the local disturbances or the unions or people not showing up for work, but a crisis simply caused by the power of the multinationals to pull their money out, right? So, in that sense, then America is not just a military imperial power. It's that the policies that they have implemented, global economic policies to safeguard their own national interests, force weaker nations to agree to the terms that are not in their national interest. But more importantly, they've also decimated their own labor force in the process. Because it's not the government deciding these things, right? It's the CEOs and boards of directors of corporations. They are the ones making millions of dollars, right? So when the government loses its ability to tell people, we are going to take care of you, right? We are going to give you health care, free education. What does it become? It becomes the security state, right? So it says, I can't give you food and I can't give you health care, but if someone tries to hurt you, I've got the biggest military in the world to take care of you. So that is the rise of the police state, right? Because the state can no longer promise good works and redemptive works, it offers itself as a security state, right? It's happening in India, it's happening in Pakistan, and in United States. Sorry, that was really a very long response to your question.
What I wanted to ask you is this concept of the other and the role of that concept in creating war. Does xenophobia lead to war?
Well, I mean, it may not lead to war because that will depend on your resources, right? But it can obviously lead to um, having this view of the other without knowing them. And the thing is, you don't create the other, you need it. If you're doing national politics and it's based in not in care and in sharing, then if you're a security state, you always will need another to stabilize your national identity, right? So or if you're trying to offer yourself as a norm, and that is classic Edward Said, right? You have to have this other to whom you impugn all the ills and bad things so that you yourself look good in comparison and can offer yourself as a system of hope and goodness. What xenophobia does is it doesn't probably underwrite war, but it makes it easy to declare it, right? I mean, think of the second Iraq War. There was absolutely no reason for it, but through the use of media and through the general apathy of the American people and somewhat, stupidity of some quarters, they were able to absolutely create a war for one corporation that benefited from it, send American troops to their death and kill a lot of Iraqis in the process, right? Um, to remove the guy that they themselves had installed in the 1960s. So, what I'm trying to highlight is that, yeah, you can build a war machinery and you can launch wars by demonizing a group of people, by basically, um, uh, you know, underwriting your aggression in those terms. There's a beautiful sentence that Gayatri Spivak uses in Can the Subaltern Speak, which is like white men saving brown women from brown men. And so it's always mobilized, we're trying to save women's rights, which I am for, absolutely. I think if I had the power, I would probably remove the Taliban and let Afghanis choose who they want. But, so yeah, I mean, xenophobia is, and what I'm saying is xenophobia is not accidental, right? It's generated through discourses of the media, of the educational system, of the power of the government to shape ideas, right? Um, and all of that is then mobilized towards a certain, at the end, Marx is right, in the last instance, it's always economics, right? It's always about money.
It's really tragic that, in our name, these wars continue, and the U.S. has been at war on average every year for the last 200 years.
Yeah, and the thing is that, like the research, if you look at the research in human consciousness, and you, of course, have studied it, I mean, fear sells very cheaply. It's very easy to sell it. So is anger, right? And so, like, emotionally mobilizing people towards these chauvinistic causes and all that, it's really easy. And it's the work of reason is always hard because you can't tell people, oh, look, an enemy over there. No, you have to show them facts and you have to patiently work through that. But it is kind of tragic and sad. I mean, as a scholar, I made a decision like, a few years ago that, okay, as cheesy and as silly as it sounds, I'm going to talk about love and kindness, right? Uh, First, because we don't talk about it a lot. And two, my idea, and this comes from Paulo Freire, is that any knowledge, practical or theoretical or philosophical, without love and hope, you know, it's not going to be effective. Facts alone are not going to change people's minds. So, how do we undo that? I mean, think of it this way: in every city, there are enclaves. I mean, I live in Wheeling, West Virginia, right? But there are people, young people here, who are pacifists, who care about the planet, who care about their neighbors, right? They are slowly trying to reclaim their communities. And it is with these people that you have aligned yourself, that I have aligned myself. We may not be able to become a huge global movement, but there are quite a few of us. One thing that I loved when the Iraq war started, we were at Florida State in the graduate school. And the day the war started, there was a spontaneous peace rally. And we had this green area by the library, which was called Landis Green. And within an hour, that place was filled by people who were opposed to war. That same year, Chomsky came and gave a talk at University of Florida, right? Uh, and I remember we drove from Tallahassee to Gainesville, and he filled their basketball stadium. 35,000 people came there to listen to Chomsky to criticize actions of the United States government. Right? So there is that as well. But the idea is to keep reminding ourselves that there are movements, there are people who want to fight against this way of looking at the world and who are trying to fight against it in their own way, and that we need to seek them out and align ourselves with them.
Professor Raja, you are also a life coach. Could you touch on that?
Okay, thank you so much for that. So, like when I left the professoriate, I was like, what do I do? What should I do now? So, I had planned to leave the university. I knew for about 1 year that I was going to resign. So I decided to enroll in two fields. I started taking design courses on user research and all. And I took like 36 courses on that. And then I took one course in life coaching. The idea behind that was that when I looked at my career, I realized what is it that I enjoy the most. And that was mentoring my students, sitting with them and they coming up with this idea, I want to write this dissertation, and brainstorming with them and working with them. I really enjoyed that part. And so after some research, I realized, okay, life coaching will give me that, like this hope that I could get in touch with someone who comes in, who contacts me and says, I'm working on a book, I'm working on a dissertation, I'm working on an application. will you work with me? So that brought me to it in terms of my abilities and finding a right venue for them. But as Zaidi Saab has so clearly retaught us again, a part of it is economics, right? So what can I do that will also use my skills, let me do some good in the world, but also pay my bills, right? So the combination of all these things brought me to this. So I trained and then registered my company in West Virginia, built my website, and thankfully, I actually have clients. So that's what I do, mentor people about their educational projects, about their research projects, uh, or about their books or any other research projects. No, thank you so much. And I mean, as Fazeel Saab mentioned, this recording videos for YouTube, it just started as something that I was doing for my students. And then I realized there are a lot of people in the world who could benefit from it. And now, I mean, I don't even know where people come from, but I get comments from all parts of the world. And these are people who are using these while they're reading a book or they have a question. And that's another kind of public service, I would say, that is gratifying to me as a person, personally, but it actually does some good in the world too. So, you know, at the end of the day, you know, we as human beings are really frail creatures, right? We but all we have is what we have in our hearts and in our minds, and if we offer that, I guess that's the least one can do in the world.
As Marx said, nothing human is alien to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with that, I wanted to close as we have gone over our 2-hour goal. But Professor Raj, I wanted to give you an opportunity for any parting thoughts.
Well, first of all, Fazil Bhai, thank you so much for doing this, and I hope we can make it like a regular feature. And Zaidi Saab and everyone else, both shukriya. And my parting thought is always is that there is a lot of evil in this world. There are a lot of terrible things. But if we can, for a moment or for a day or an hour, give someone some hope, some kind of good, kindness, right? A little generosity. I think that's what we all owe to each other and to this world. And that's my message always, to anyone that encounters me.